Rain always seemed to know when a life was falling apart. It drifted through the city in soft silver lines, turning bright streets into blurred reflections. Cars moved slowly across the wet pavement, and strangers hurried beneath umbrellas without looking at one another. The world kept moving, even when someone's heart had stopped believing it could. I stood on the sidewalk with one suitcase and a backpack that felt heavier than everything I had lost. Only 3 days earlier, I had believed I was building a future. Caleb Weston and I had spent 4 years planning a life together. We talked about buying a little house with a porch. We argued over paint colors and laughed about adopting an old rescue dog. Every dream felt ordinary, and somehow that made it beautiful. Then I discovered that every promise had been built on lies. My lawyer told me to be patient. My friends offered their spare couches, but I couldn't bear becoming another burden in lives that were already busy enough. So I walked. Sometimes moving forward was easier than standing still. The rain soaked through my jacket before I reached the bus station. I sat on a cold metal bench and stared at the envelope in my hands. This paper was thick, elegant. My name had been written in careful handwriting. I stepped inside. The receptionist already knew my name. That surprised me more than anything else. She offered a gentle smile before directing me toward a private elevator. My heartbeat grew louder with every floor. When the elevator doors opened, I found myself standing before a dark wooden entrance. For several long seconds, I couldn't move. Then the door opened before I could knock. The man standing there looked exactly like the business magazines described him. Tall, perfectly dressed, calm in the kind of way storms never were. Grayson Hale. His gray-blue eyes studied me without warmth or cruelty, only caution. "You must be Rowan Mercer." His voice was low and controlled. I nodded. "I am." A long silence settled between us. Finally, he stepped aside. "My grandfather made me promise that if you ever needed help, this home would be open to you." He paused. "I always keep my promises." Those words sounded respectful, yet something beneath them carried exhaustion. I quietly entered. The apartment was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river. Books lined entire walls. Soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers. Everything was spotless, perfect, and strangely lonely. Grayson closed the door behind us. "This arrangement is temporary." "I understand. You'll have the guest room." "Thank you." "There are a few rules." I nodded again. "No personal questions." "All right." "No entering my office." "Of course." "We live separate lives." "I can do that." "If you find somewhere else to stay, you leave." "I won't stay longer than necessary." Another silence followed. He looked at me as though trying to decide whether trusting me had already become a mistake. "I'll have Vivian send over anything you need." Before I could answer, he disappeared down the hallway. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet somehow it had left me emotionally exhausted. The guest room overlooked the city skyline. A neatly folded blanket rested at the end of the bed. Fresh towels waited in the bathroom. Someone had clearly prepared everything before I arrived. I placed my suitcase beside the bed. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe. That evening passed almost entirely in silence. At dinner, we sat across from each other at a table large enough for 10 people. Only 2 plates occupied it. Neither of us spoke much. The sound of silverware touching porcelain became the loudest conversation in the room. I noticed tiny things instead. He barely touched his food. He answered work emails between bites. Every few minutes, he glanced toward an old framed photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. There was sadness in his eyes. Not fresh sadness. The kind that had quietly learned how to survive. When dinner ended, I washed my own dishes. As I turned off the kitchen light, I noticed another plate resting on the counter, covered carefully. Still warm. A handwritten note lay beside it. "In case you get hungry later." There was no signature. None was needed. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The apartment was quiet except for distant piano music. Passing the living room, I noticed the framed photograph lying face down on the floor. The glass had cracked. Perhaps it had fallen during the night. Without thinking, I carefully removed the damaged frame. Hours later, after finding a replacement frame in a nearby shop, I restored the picture exactly as it had been. It showed Grayson standing beside the elderly man I had once helped. Both of them were smiling. It was the first genuine smile I had imagined on Grayson's face. When he returned home that evening, he stopped in the hallway. His eyes settled on the repaired photograph. For several long seconds, he simply stared. "You fixed it. I hoped you wouldn't mind." His fingers brushed lightly across the new frame. "My grandfather liked this picture. I could tell." He looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time. "Thank you." The words were quiet, almost reluctant, but they were real. I smiled gently. "You're welcome." Nothing more was said. He walked toward his office. I returned to my room. Yet somehow the apartment felt a little less empty than it had the night before. Neither of us realized it then. But somewhere between an untouched dinner, a repaired photograph, and 2 simple words of gratitude, the walls around our hearts had shifted ever so slightly. Neither of us had opened the door. But for the first time in a very long while, neither of us had locked it completely. The first week passed with quiet routines that neither of us acknowledged. Every morning, I woke before sunrise. Every morning, a fresh cup of coffee waited on the kitchen counter. No note. No conversation. Just coffee made exactly the way I liked it. I never asked how Grayson knew I preferred 1 spoon of sugar and a little cream. Perhaps he had simply noticed. He seemed like the kind of man who saw everything but spoke about almost nothing. In return, I found small ways to thank him without using words. When he returned late from work, dinner was waiting in the oven. When his dry cleaning arrived, I carried it upstairs before he could. When his favorite reading chair developed a loose leg, I repaired it before he noticed. Our kindness became a quiet language. Neither of us admitted we were learning how to speak it. The penthouse no longer felt cold. Morning sunlight stretched across the wooden floors, filling the rooms with a gentle warmth. The silence that once felt awkward slowly became peaceful. Sometimes we sat in the living room with our own books. Hours passed without conversation. Yet the quiet no longer felt lonely. One rainy evening, lightning flashed outside the windows. The power flickered for only a second. I looked up from my novel. Grayson was standing by the glass, staring into the storm. "You like the rain?" I asked softly. He smiled without turning around. "I don't." "Then why watch it?" "It reminds me that even storms move on." His answer lingered in the room long after the thunder faded. A few nights later, I woke from another nightmare. The same dream. Caleb smiling while emptying our bank account. My apartment disappearing behind locked doors. Every promise turning into paper. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my breathing. A quiet knock came at my door. "Rowan?" It was Grayson. "I'm fine," I answered too quickly. The door opened only a few inches. He didn't step inside. "I made tea." His voice carried no pressure, only patience. I joined him in the kitchen. Steam curled gently from 2 mugs. Neither of us mentioned the nightmare. We simply sat together while the city slept. Sometimes silence could comfort more than advice. Over the following weeks, I began noticing things about Grayson that most people probably never saw. He skipped lunch almost every day. He rubbed the bridge of his nose whenever meetings became stressful. He smiled at old jazz records, even though he rarely smiled at people. Most surprising of all, he loved old black and white films. One Saturday evening, I walked into the living room to find one already playing. "You watch these?" I asked. "They're honest. They're fictional. So are most people." I laughed. A real laugh. The sound surprised both of us. Grayson looked at me for a moment before laughing quietly himself. It transformed his entire face. For the first time, he didn't look like the intimidating billionaire every magazine admired. He simply looked like a man who had forgotten what happiness sounded like. A few days later, Vivian Brooks arrived carrying several folders. She greeted me warmly. "So you're the famous roommate." I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm hardly famous." She smiled knowingly. I've worked with Grayson for 8 years. And I've never seen him come home before midnight. I glanced toward the office. He comes home for dinner now. Vivian folded her arms with satisfaction. Exactly. Before leaving, she whispered with a playful smile, "Keep doing whatever you're doing." I watched her leave, feeling strangely embarrassed. That evening I decided to cook. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The smell of garlic, rosemary, and fresh bread filled the apartment. Grayson entered quietly, loosening his tie. He stopped the moment he reached the kitchen. "You cooked." "I hope that's okay." He looked at the table for several seconds. "I don't remember the last time someone cooked for me." We ate slowly. The conversation drifted naturally. Favorite books, childhood memories, music, places we dreamed of visiting. Nothing painful, nothing forced. Just two people discovering each other one careful sentence at a time. When dinner ended, he looked at me with unusual softness. "This feels..." He searched for the right word. "Comfortable." I smiled. I was thinking the same thing. As trust slowly grew, pieces of our past quietly surfaced. One evening, we found ourselves watching the river through the enormous windows. "I was engaged once," Grayson said unexpectedly. I turned toward him. "You don't have to tell me." "I know." He took a slow breath. He wasn't interested in me. His eyes remained fixed on the water. He loved the company. The words carried years of quiet pain. When he couldn't have both, Grayson stopped speaking. He chose neither. I understood without needing more details. A long silence followed. Then I whispered, "I know what betrayal feels like." He looked at me. Not with pity. With recognition. For the first time, it felt like neither of us was carrying our grief alone. 2 weeks later, Grayson invited me to accompany him to a charity gala. "I'll probably spend most of the evening talking to investors." "Then why invite me?" His expression softened. "I'd rather not arrive alone." The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Elegant music floated through the air. People greeted Grayson with admiration. Some greeted him with fear. Several glanced toward me with curious smiles. One woman approached us. "You finally brought your partner." Before either of us could answer, she continued speaking about fundraising. Neither of us corrected her. Later, as the orchestra began playing a slow melody, couples stepped onto the dance floor. Grayson looked toward the musicians, then toward me. "Do you dance?" "A little." He hesitated. "So do I." For one suspended moment, it seemed he might ask. My heartbeat quickened. Then his phone rang. The moment disappeared. Business had found him again. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. The city lights reflected across the windshield like scattered stars. The silence between us felt different now. Not empty. Full. Full of words neither of us was ready to say. As I looked out at the sleeping city, a quiet realization settled into my heart. When I had arrived at the penthouse, it was only a place to survive. Now, without meaning to, I had started looking forward to every shared breakfast, every quiet evening, every ordinary conversation. For the first time since Caleb's betrayal, the future no longer looked like an endless hallway filled with locked doors. And somewhere beside me, with both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, sat a man who still believed he had built walls no one could cross. Neither of us understood it yet, but those walls were already beginning to feel less like protection, and more like the distance between two hearts that had quietly started finding their way toward each other. Autumn arrived quietly. The trees along the river traded their summer green for shades of amber and gold. Cool air drifted through the city, carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves. The mornings felt sharper, but inside the penthouse, life had settled into a gentle rhythm. For the first time in months, I felt safe. That feeling lasted exactly 4 days. It began with a single headline. Local designer linked to financial fraud now living with billionaire CEO. My hands froze around my coffee mug. The article repeated the same accusations that had once turned my life upside down. It claimed I had stolen money, manipulated clients, and somehow convinced Grayson Hale to protect me. Every sentence twisted the truth. Every lie sounded believable. By noon, the story had spread across social media. By evening, television reporters were standing outside Grayson's headquarters. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and found Grayson reading the article in complete silence. His face revealed nothing. "Grayson." He looked up. "I didn't hide any of this from you. I know there was an investigation. I was cleared. I know. But the internet doesn't care." He folded the newspaper carefully. "The board of directors will." Those words settled heavily between us. For the first time since I had moved into his home, neither of us knew what to say. The following morning, Grayson left before sunrise. He forgot his coffee. He never forgot his coffee. The empty mug remained on the kitchen counter long after he was gone. It was a small thing, yet somehow it hurt. The day stretched endlessly. News channels replayed the story. Comment sections filled with cruel assumptions. People who had never met me suddenly believed they knew everything about my life. I turned my phone off. Silence felt kinder. That afternoon, Vivian arrived looking more worried than I had ever seen her. "I've spoken with Grayson." I searched her face. "What happened?" "The board wants answers. I can leave." She immediately shook her head. "That's not what he wants." "Then why does it feel like everything is changing?" Vivian sighed softly. "Because he's scared." "Scared of me?" "No." She looked directly into my eyes. "Scared of losing everything he's rebuilt." Before I could ask another question, her phone rang. She answered quietly. The color drained from her face. "I have to go." "What happened?" "Someone just checked into the company lobby asking for you." My stomach tightened. "Who?" She hesitated. "Caleb Weston." I hadn't seen Caleb in almost a year, yet I recognized him instantly. He stood outside the building wearing the same confident smile that had once convinced me he would never hurt me. He looked exactly the same, only my heart had changed. "Rowan." His voice sounded strangely familiar. "I've missed you." "You don't get to say that." People walked around us, unaware of the storm standing on the sidewalk. "I made mistakes. You destroyed my life. I can explain." "You already did." His smile faded. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." I laughed bitterly. "You emptied our accounts. I was desperate. You signed loans in my name. I thought I could repay them. You disappeared. I was ashamed." Every excuse sounded smaller than the damage it tried to cover. Finally, I stepped backward. "I'm done listening." As I turned away, Caleb spoke one final sentence. "You should be careful." I stopped. "Dominic Pierce isn't finished with you." Before I could respond, he disappeared into the crowd. That evening, I returned home exhausted. The penthouse felt unusually quiet. Grayson stood in his office with the door half open. He was speaking on the phone. "If Rowan has hidden something else." My footsteps stopped. "The company can't survive another scandal." I couldn't hear the rest. I didn't stay long enough. The words echoed painfully inside me. If Rowan has hidden something else. After everything we had shared, he still doubted me. I quietly returned to my room. For hours I stared at the ceiling. Maybe this had always been temporary. Maybe I had simply forgotten. The days that followed became painfully distant. Breakfast appeared on the counter no longer. Dinner was eaten separately. Our conversations became polite, short, careful. Every room suddenly felt larger. Every silence became heavier. One evening, I walked into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. Grayson was reading documents. "I thought you might." He barely looked up. "I'm busy." The words were not cruel. They were worse. They were empty. I quietly carried both cups back into the kitchen. One remained untouched until it turned cold. Late one night, I passed his office. The light was still on. For a brief moment, I almost knocked. Almost asked whether we could talk. Instead, I kept walking. Fear had become louder than hope. A week later, another article appeared. This one claimed I had intentionally moved into Grayson's home to gain access to confidential business information. The company's shares dropped. Investors demanded explanations. Dominic Pierce appeared on television expressing concern for corporate integrity. Watching him pretend to care made me sick. I finally understood. This had never been about me. It had always been about destroying Grayson, and I had become the easiest weapon. That night, I packed my suitcase. The same suitcase I had carried through the rain weeks earlier. Somehow it felt even heavier now. I folded my clothes carefully, placed my books inside, wrapped my sketchbook in an old sweater. Then my eyes settled on the repaired photograph of Grayson and his grandfather. I picked it up gently. Instead of taking it with me, I placed it back on the shelf exactly where it belonged. Beside it, I left a handwritten letter. Grayson, you once told me you always keep your promises. Thank you for keeping your grandfather's. You gave me safety when I had nowhere else to go. You gave me quiet when my life had become noise. Most of all, you reminded me that kindness still exists. I never lied to you. I simply wanted the chance to become someone who deserved your trust. I'm leaving because I refuse to become another reason your world falls apart. Take care of yourself. Rowan. I placed the envelope beneath the frame. The apartment was silent. The hallway looked exactly as it had on the day I arrived. Only now, every corner held a memory. The coffee waiting each morning. The old movies. Shared dinners. Quiet smiles. All the ordinary moments that had somehow become extraordinary. I picked up my suitcase. Without making a sound, I walked toward the front door. Just as my hand reached the handle, I paused. For one impossible second, I wished the door behind me would open. I wished Grayson would ask me to stay. No footsteps came. No voice broke the silence. Only the soft ticking of the clock filled the empty hallway. I closed my eyes. Then I stepped into the cold autumn night. Behind me, the apartment lights continued to glow against the darkness, looking warm enough to be called home. Ahead of me stretched a lonely street with no clear destination. For the second time in a year, I walked away carrying everything I owned. But this time, the weight inside my heart was far heavier than the suitcase in my hand. Because losing a home was painful. Losing the person who had quietly become home without ever promising to be. That kind of heartbreak was almost impossible to survive. The penthouse had never been so quiet. When Grayson returned home that night, he expected to find the soft glow of a lamp in the guest room. He expected to hear pages turning as I read another novel before bed. Instead, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The closet stood open. The silence felt unbearable. He walked slowly into the living room, trying to convince himself I had only gone for a walk. Then his eyes found the photograph on the shelf. Beneath it rested a white envelope. His name was written across the front. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Finally, he opened it. As he read each line, the color slowly faded from his face. By the time he reached the final sentence, his hands were trembling. I never lied to you. The words echoed through every corner of the apartment. He remembered the untouched cups of tea, the unanswered smiles, the distance he had allowed to grow because fear had spoken louder than trust. He closed his eyes. I was wrong, he whispered into the empty room. The following morning, Grayson arrived at the office before anyone else. Vivian noticed immediately that something had changed. You read the letter. He nodded. I let him leave. You let fear make the decision. He didn't argue. Because she was right. For months, Rowan had shown him nothing except honesty, patience, and kindness. One headline had been enough to make him question everything. Grayson had spent years believing betrayal always arrived disguised as love. Without realizing it, he had punished the one person who had never betrayed him. I'm going to fix this, he said quietly. Vivian gave him a determined smile. Then let's start with the truth. Within hours, the company's legal team reopened every financial document connected to Rowan's case. Vivian worked alongside independent investigators. Old emails were recovered. Deleted bank transfers were traced. Phone records revealed repeated conversations between Caleb Weston and Dominic Pierce. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. This had never been an accident. It had been a carefully planned attack. Dominic knew he couldn't defeat Grayson through business alone. So he chose something far more personal. He used Rowan's past as a weapon. Every false article, every anonymous source, every leaked document, all of it had been arranged to destroy Grayson's reputation by destroying the man living under his roof. Late that afternoon, Vivian hurried into Grayson's office carrying a folder. "We found everything." Grayson looked up. "Everything?" She nodded. Enough to clear Rowan completely. For the first time in weeks, hope entered the room. There was only one problem. No one knew where I had gone. My phone remained switched off. The apartment I once rented was still unavailable. Friends hadn't heard from me. Hours became an entire day. A day became two. Grayson searched everywhere. He visited the small bookstore where I used to spend Saturday mornings, the cafe where we once shared coffee after the charity gala, the riverside park where I liked to sketch. Each place held memories. None held me. Every empty location reminded him how easily someone could disappear when they believed they no longer belonged. On the third morning, Vivian quietly placed another file on his desk. "This isn't from the investigators." Grayson opened it. Inside was a volunteer registration form. My name appeared near the bottom. Community Hope Shelter. The same shelter supported by the charitable foundation his grandfather had loved. Grayson smiled sadly. Of course. When life had broken me before, I had chosen to help other people carry their own burdens. That was simply who I was. The shelter stood at the edge of the city beside a small church. Children laughed in the courtyard while volunteers prepared lunch. Everything felt peaceful. I was carrying boxes of donated blankets when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. I didn't turn immediately. Somehow I already knew. Rowan. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I slowly faced him. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The autumn wind moved gently between us. "You found me." "I should have come sooner." I looked down at the box in my hands. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you the truth." His voice cracked. "The truth is that I was afraid." I finally met his eyes. Afraid of what? Loving someone enough to lose them. Silence settled around us. "I spent years believing trust was dangerous," he continued. "When those stories appeared, I let old wounds decide who you were." His eyes filled with quiet regret. "I didn't trust the man standing in front of me. I trusted my fear." My chest tightened. "I thought you believed the worst about me." "I did." He lowered his head. "And I've hated myself for it every moment since." We walked slowly toward a quiet garden behind the shelter. The noise of the city faded into birdsong and rustling leaves. "I met Caleb because I believed love meant earning someone's approval," I admitted. "I kept trying to become enough." I smiled sadly. "But people who truly care don't make you prove your worth every day." Grayson listened without interrupting. "When I came to your apartment," I continued, "I wasn't looking for love. I was only hoping to survive. And now—" I looked at him. "Now I know what home feels like." His eyes shimmered. "I thought home was a place." "So did I." Another long silence passed. Then he took one careful step closer. "I don't want a house without you in it." The words were simple. There were no grand speeches. No dramatic music. Only honesty. "I don't expect forgiveness today," he said. "I only want the chance to earn it." I searched his face. The proud billionaire CEO was gone. Standing before me was simply a man willing to admit he had made the worst mistake of his life. Slowly, I reached for his hand. His fingers trembled as they met mine. "I can't promise I'll stop hurting overnight," I whispered. "You don't have to. I'll still have bad days. I'll stay. I'll still remember what happened. We'll remember together." For the first time since leaving the penthouse, I allowed myself to believe that broken trust could sometimes be repaired. Not by forgetting, but by choosing honesty every single day. The following week, Grayson held a press conference. Reporters crowded the room. Cameras flashed constantly. Instead of standing behind him, I stood beside him. Grayson looked directly into the cameras. The accusations against Rowan Mercer are false. He presented the evidence. Financial records, witness statements, messages connecting Dominic Pierce and Caleb Weston. Every lie unraveled under the weight of the truth. Questions poured in from every direction. Grayson answered each one calmly. Then, before leaving the podium, he said something no one expected. I nearly lost someone extraordinary because I listened to fear instead of facts. He turned toward me. I won't make that mistake again. For a brief moment, the room fell completely silent. Outside, the autumn rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, warming the city streets below. It felt as though the storm that had followed us for so long was finally beginning to pass. Not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because, at last, we had chosen each other over our fears. And sometimes that choice is where every true love story quietly begins. Winter arrived gently. The first snowfall covered the city in quiet white, softening sharp buildings and busy streets. The river moved more slowly beneath the cold sky, reflecting pale morning light like polished glass. 6 months had passed since the press conference. Life had not become perfect. It had become honest. That made all the difference. The headlines disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. Dominic Pierce faced criminal charges for fraud, defamation, and corporate conspiracy. Caleb Weston eventually admitted to forging financial documents and accepted responsibility for the damage he had caused. Justice could never return the years I had lost, but it gave me something unexpected: freedom. For the first time in a long while, I no longer woke wondering whether my past would destroy my future. Instead, I woke to the quiet smell of fresh coffee. Some habits were worth keeping. Every morning, Grayson still left a warm mug waiting for me on the kitchen counter. The only difference was that now he stayed to drink his own beside me. We no longer needed silence to protect ourselves. Sometimes we talked for an hour before either of us noticed the time. Sometimes we simply watched the sunrise together. Neither felt incomplete. The Hale Foundation had expanded during the winter. It now restored abandoned homes for families rebuilding their lives after financial hardship, illness, or unexpected loss. Grayson asked me to lead the interior design projects. At first, I hesitated. I've never managed something this large. He smiled over the edge of his coffee cup. You once rebuilt a stranger's hope with nothing more than kindness. I think you can handle paint colors. I laughed. You make it sound simple. With you. His eyes met mine. It usually is. Working together became our favorite part of each day. Every restored home reminded me that broken things were not worthless. Sometimes they simply needed patient hands. Perhaps people weren't so different. One Saturday afternoon, we visited the first house our team had completed. A widowed father opened the front door with tears in his eyes. His young daughter ran from room to room, laughing as sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows. "This feels like home," the little girl whispered. I glanced toward Grayson. He was already looking at me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. That single sentence carried more meaning than any award or business success ever could. Life slowly filled with ordinary happiness. We argued over whose turn it was to cook dinner. We rescued an aging golden retriever from a local shelter and named him Oliver because he insisted on stealing socks. We spent rainy evenings watching the same black and white movies Grayson once watched alone. He still quoted the ending before it happened. I still pretended to be surprised. The apartment that once echoed with silence now carried small sounds of everyday life. Footsteps. Soft music. Laughter. Oliver's paws racing across the hardwood floor. Those simple moments became my favorite memories. A few days before Christmas, Grayson surprised me. "I want to show you something." He led me upstairs to a door I had never seen open. "This was my grandfather's room," he said quietly. "I haven't let anyone inside since he passed away." He turned the handle. Warm afternoon light spilled through tall windows. Books covered every shelf. An old piano rested near the fireplace. Family photographs lined the walls. It felt less like a museum and more like a heart that had been waiting patiently to beat again. On the desk rested a small wooden box. Grayson opened it carefully. Inside lay a folded letter. My grandfather wrote this before he died. He handed it to me. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Grayson, if you are reading this, then life has continued without me, and that is exactly as it should. You have always believed strength means standing alone. One day you will meet someone whose kindness asks for nothing in return. Do not let fear convince you that love is another word for loss. If Rowan Mercer ever enters your life again, trust the man before you judge the pain behind him. Some people arrive carrying exactly the light we have spent years searching for. By the time I reached the final line, my vision had blurred. Grayson quietly wiped a tear from his own cheek. He knew, I whispered. He understood both of us long before we understood ourselves. Grayson nodded. I think he saw the people we could become. That evening, snow fell outside the windows. The city glowed beneath thousands of tiny lights. We stood together on the balcony wrapped in heavy coats, watching snowflakes drift through the night air. I've been thinking, Grayson said. Dangerous habit. He smiled. It usually is. Then he became serious again. I don't want us to spend our lives measuring love by the mistakes we survived. I looked at him. I want us to measure it by the mornings we choose each other. The words settled softly between us. He reached into his coat pocket. For one nervous second, I wondered if he was holding a ring. Instead, he pulled out a small silver key. Our foundation finished restoring an old lakeside house. He placed the key in my hand. I bought it. I blinked in surprise. For us. For home. No dramatic proposal. No audience. No perfect speech. Just one quiet promise from the man who had once been afraid to let anyone close. I wrapped my fingers around the key. I'd like that. His forehead rested gently against mine. So would I. Spring arrived before we realized how quickly winter had passed. The lakeside house became everything we never knew we needed. There were tall maple trees that turned golden every autumn. A small dock where Oliver insisted on chasing ducks he could never catch. A reading room filled with books collected from both our lives. And a wide kitchen where every morning began exactly the same way. Coffee. Laughter. Quiet conversation. Sunlight spilling across the wooden table. One morning, while I prepared breakfast, Grayson walked in carrying 2 mugs. He handed one to me. Still 1 spoon of sugar? I smiled. You remembered. I noticed the first week you lived with me, and you've remembered ever since. I plan to. He reached for my hand. His fingers fit naturally between mine, as though they had always belonged there. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the morning sun. Inside, the silence no longer carried loneliness. It carried peace. Sometimes love does not arrive with fireworks or impossible promises. Sometimes it begins with a warm cup of coffee left quietly on a kitchen counter. Sometimes it grows through ordinary days, honest conversations, and the courage to stay after trust has been broken. And sometimes, after believing you have lost everything, you discover that home was never a building. It was the person who looked at your broken heart and chose to remain. As the morning light filled our little lakeside home, I realized that the greatest gift life had given me was not escaping betrayal. It was finding someone who taught me that love, when built on truth, never asks you to become someone else. It simply asks you to come home.